going to start with something uncomfortable. Something that kicks you inside even though you don't want to admit it. You're not consistent. Neither you, nor I, nor anyone else. Absolute consistency is a myth we use to sleep peacefully at night. But the truth is something else. You know it when you look inside and find that you think one thing, say another, and do something completely different. That knot in your stomach when you act against what you believe. It's called cognitive dissonance. And it's right at the heart of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. That silent poison that we all carry inside and that we love to detect in others, but never in ourselves. It makes us feel superior to point it out, but we rarely dare to look it straight in the face in the mirror. And here comes the most twisted part. Hypocrisy is not an accident. It's a strategy. It's a defense mechanism that our mind activates to protect one of the most fragile things we have: self-image. We want to see ourselves as good people, as consistent, upright, true to our values. But the world isn't black and white. We face impossible decisions, external pressures, contradictory emotions. And when our actions don't align with what we believe, conflict appears. That internal tension, that brutal discomfort that whispers to you, this isn't right. So, in order not to break inside, we justify, we deceive ourselves, and we start to build a version of ourselves that isn't entirely true, but that we need to believe. Because accepting the contradiction hurts a lot. Recognizing that we are inconsistent wounds the ego, shakes the identity. And in that emotional earthquake, hypocrisy appears as a refuge. It's that internal voice that tells you, you did it for a good reason. You had no other choice. You're not like the others. It calms you, it numbs you, but it also distances you from yourself, and it doesn't stay private. Hypocrisy has found its favorite stage, society, a place where everyone wears masks, where social networks are showcases of feigned virtue, where appearing matters more than being. There, hypocrisy is no longer a slip-up, it's a norm. You are rewarded for pretending. You are applauded for showing a version of you that even you don't recognize. And the worst part is that you start to believe it. But this has a price, because the more you distance yourself from what you really are, the more emptiness you feel inside, the harder it becomes to find meaning. And that void, that disconnection, is not filled with likes or pretty words. It can only be filled with truth. And here comes the darkest part. We are all hypocrites, not maliciously, not as villains, but as humans. Because being 100% consistent all the time is a utopia, but the difference lies in something key: awareness. There are those who live in their hypocrisy without questioning it, and there are those who face it, those who dare to ask themselves, why do I say this if I do the opposite? What's behind this contradiction? That question, that discomfort, is the first step towards authenticity. Because being authentic isn't being perfect. It's being honest. It's saying, I'm in conflict, but I'm not going to pretend I'm not. It's accepting that sometimes you fail, that sometimes you contradict yourself, but without disguising it, without justifying yourself all the time. Because every time you rationalize an inconsistency, you give a little more power to that false version of you. But let's be brutally clear. It's not easy. Because we live surrounded by expectations. Family, friends, work, networks, society, everyone expects something from you. Everyone has an idea of how you should be. And in that noise, it's easy to lose your voice. It's easy to fall into the trap of showing what is expected, even though inside you are falling apart. And the longer you do it, the further you move away from who you really are. There's a cruel paradox in all of this. The more you pretend, the lonelier you feel. Because it doesn't matter how many people admire you if they admire someone you're not. It doesn't matter how much they validate you if what they recognize is an edited version. And there comes the void, the real one, the one that doesn't show from the outside, but devours you inside. Hypocrisy is a social drug. It gives you immediate pleasure, acceptance, belonging, recognition. But in the long run, it charges you dearly: anxiety, dissatisfaction, disconnection. It's a mental trap. It makes you think you're doing well when in reality, you're losing yourself. And here comes the twist. Hypocrisy is not eliminated by willpower. It's not a matter of being a better person. It's a matter of understanding how your mind works. Because if you don't understand the mechanism, you repeat the pattern. Cognitive dissonance is at the center of everything. That tension between what you believe and what you do. That discomfort that you try to avoid at all costs. And to avoid it, you justify. But if instead of justifying, you stop and listen to that tension, you can use it as a compass, as a sign that something isn't aligned. Because there lies the key, not to ignore the discomfort, but to investigate it. To ask yourself, why do I feel this way? What part of me am I betraying? Those questions hurt. They're not pretty, they don't make you look good, but they bring you closer to something worth more than any applause: authenticity. Hypocrisy is also socially contagious. The more you see others practicing it, the more you allow yourself to do it too. It's like a masquerade game where everyone pretends not to see the other's costumes, a silent pact of shared lies. And the more you participate, the further you move away from yourself. But there's a way out. Break the pact. Stop pretending, even if it's just in your thoughts, even if it's just when you're alone, because all change starts there. In that moment of brutal silence where you dare to see yourself without filters, where you admit that you're not who you appear to be and not even who you thought you were, but that you're willing to discover it, to rebuild yourself from the truth, from the real, even if it hurts, even if you lose things along the way, because what you're going to gain is much greater. Peace. That peace that only comes when you stop living a borrowed life. And there's something else. Something you probably don't want to hear, but need to know. You're never going to be completely consistent. There will always be contradictions. There will always be times when you fail. But that's not what defines you. What defines you is what you do when you realize. If you hide, or if you decide to face it. If you justify, or if you correct. That's the difference between living in hypocrisy or living with awareness. Because true freedom isn't in doing whatever you want. It's in being who you really are, even if that means disappointing expectations, breaking with the established, being judged. Authenticity is an act of rebellion in a world that rewards disguise. But it's the only way to live in peace with yourself. Think about this. How much of what you do is really yours? How many decisions do you make out of fear of looking bad, of being rejected, of not fitting in? Every time you choose to please rather than be true to yourself, you reinforce that internal hypocrisy. Every time you silence an uncomfortable truth to maintain harmony, you feed that character that is not you. But you can let it go. Not all at once, not in one day, but you can start by looking, by questioning, by daring to stop lying to yourself. Because the first step to stop being a hypocrite is to stop pretending that you're not. And in that moment, something changes. The tension doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes a guide, an indicator that you're alive, that you still care about being a better person. Because hypocrisy only becomes a real problem when you normalize it, when you stop seeing it, when you adapt so much to it that it becomes your second skin. But you weren't born to pretend. You were born to discover who you really are. And that, although it seems contradictory, starts by accepting your contradictions, by looking at them without judgment, without fear, and saying, "This is also me, but it doesn't define me. I can change." The human mind is expert in deceiving itself. It's a survivor. And in its effort to protect you from pain, it builds narratives. It tells you stories that soften the guilt, that dilute the responsibility. But those stories have cracks. And if you stop long enough, you see them. You feel that something doesn't fit, that something inside you demands consistency, not perfection. Consistency, that something is your real self, waiting for you to rescue it from the image you project, waiting for you to stop acting, to start truly living. And here, this journey ends, not with a closed lesson, nor with a pretty moral, but with a question that only you can answer. Are you willing to live with the lights on, even if that means seeing your own shadows? Because if you are, then you've already taken the first step towards freedom. The real one. The one that doesn't need applause. The one that doesn't need masks. The one that is born when you stop lying to yourself. And finally, you start to be. You. And now that you've started to see your shadows, that you've put that uncomfortable truth on the table, the hypocrisy that inhabits you, it's time to take a deeper step. Because there's a layer even more hidden, more silent, more dangerous. And it's not in what you say, not even in what you do. It's in what you keep silent. Because the most hypocritical thing of all is not what we show to the world, but what we avoid showing even to ourselves. That part of you that you repress because it doesn't fit with your idea of a good person. That emotion you feel but don't allow yourself to accept. That dark part that exists in you and that you prefer to deny before integrating. And here we enter another territory, the psychological shadow. Carl Jung explained it brutally. We all have an unconscious part composed of desires, impulses, and thoughts that we reject. What we don't accept in ourselves, we bury. But the repressed doesn't disappear. What you deny governs you from the darkness. And the more you strive to appear virtuous, the more powerful your shadow becomes. And what does this have to do with hypocrisy? Everything. Because the more you strive to build a correct identity, the greater the gap between what you are and what you appear to be. And in that gap, hypocrisy is born. Not as a deliberate act, but as a symptom of deep self-deception. You start to live a double life, the visible and the denied. And the more you deny your shadow, the more hypocritical you become without even knowing it. The shadow is not just your mistakes. It's also your unlived potential. It's that you that you put on pause because someone told you it wasn't right. And if you don't look at it, if you don't face it, you'll live trapped in a domesticated version of yourself, a politically correct version, superficial, dead scared, and you'll call it maturity, responsibility, being a good person. But it's not that. It's self-censorship. It's emotional hypocrisy. And there's something even more fucked up. The more time you spend repressing yourself, the harder it is to distinguish what you really are from what you pretend to be. You get so used to the mask that it seems like your face. But it's not. And you know it in those moments of silence when there's no one looking, and yet you feel uncomfortable with yourself. Because the shadow always speaks, sometimes in the form of anxiety, sometimes in the form of contained rage, other times in the form of apathy. But it speaks. And if you don't listen to it, it screams. And if you don't recognize it, it destroys. That's why hypocrisy is not just a moral defect, it's an emotional bomb about to explode. The more you lie to yourself, the more you disconnect. The more you pretend, the more you fragment. And internal fragmentation is the anteroom to psychological collapse. And I know this path is not comfortable. Because looking at your shadow is not aesthetic. It doesn't look good on social networks. It doesn't get likes. What gets likes is the perfect speech, the virtue of display, the superficial commitment. But inside, you're in ruins, because nothing built from the denial of oneself can hold up. Here comes another critical point. The environment reinforces your hypocrisy. Do you know why? Because no one benefits from you being yourself 100%. Because your authenticity makes them uncomfortable. It forces them to question their own masks. And most don't want that. They prefer you to follow the script, to say what's appropriate, to do the right thing, even though inside you're dying. And that's brutal, because you're forced to betray yourself to belong. And do you know what is the most common form of hypocrisy that no one wants to admit? Self-abandonment. Yes. Every time you say yes when you wanted to say no, every time you minimize yourself to not make others uncomfortable, every time you choose the safe path, even though it frustrates you. That's also hypocrisy, because you're acting against yourself. You're betraying your truth to fit into a system that doesn't represent you, and then you wonder why you're tired, why it's hard to motivate yourself, why you feel that nothing fills you. It's because you live misaligned, because your soul screams one thing and your life says another. And no matter how beautiful the facade is, if the base is rotten, everything falls. Sooner or later, it falls. Here's another brutal idea. Hypocrisy is addictive because it rewards you. It gives you quick results, social approval, momentary peace, less conflict. But it also imprisons you because every time you need more of that approval to feel valid, every time you move further away from yourself. And there comes a point where you no longer know if you are you or a collection of masks that you accumulated to survive. And then it's time to ask the toughest question. At what moment did you stop being you? When was the first time you decided to pretend to avoid conflict? And why did you never go back? Because that moment exists. That point where you felt that being authentic was too costly. And from then on, you started to act, to build a narrative, an image, a comfortable identity, but fake. And do you know what's worse? That deep inside, you still know who you were before the mask. That free, spontaneous, honest version that no longer has space in your life. But it still exists. And it waits. It waits for you to stop acting. It waits for you to give it voice again. It waits for you to have the courage to live without needing to pretend. Because true authenticity is not perfect. It's uncomfortable, contradictory, sometimes clumsy, but it's real. And that makes it powerful. Because when you stop trying to seem perfect, you can finally start to be free. And that inner freedom, the one of living without masks, without double speeches, without betraying yourself every time someone expects something from you, that freedom is priceless. But it also has no shortcuts. It only comes when you go through hypocrisy, not when you deny it. So here we are, you and your shadow, you and your real version. And now you know that hypocrisy is not just something you do, it's something you allow, that you feed, that you normalize, but it's also something you can dismantle, not with guilt, but with awareness, not with reproaches, but with bravery, because the only way to regain your life is to stop interpreting it and start, finally, to live it. And since we're here, on the edge of that discomfort you've been avoiding all your life, let's keep digging. Because there's something else, something no one tells you, but that affects everything you do. The silent hypocrisy of the small decisions. Yes, I'm not talking about the big acts of personal betrayal. I'm not talking about saying you're vegan while you hide to eat a steak, nor about preaching kindness while you destroy others behind their back. I'm talking about those micro acts of hypocrisy that happen every day and that you've normalized so much that you no longer see them. Every time you say, "I don't have time," when you really don't feel like it. Every time you claim that you're fine when you're falling apart inside. Every time you feign interest in a conversation just so they don't think ill of you. These tiny, everyday gestures are like drops that erode your identity until you're hollow inside. And the most fucked up part? No one is going to punish you for it. No one is going to point it out, because everyone does it. It's the collective hypocrisy, the routine of accepted self-deception. But do you know who does notice? Your subconscious. Because even though you're not fully aware of each of these small lies, your emotional system is. And what starts as just an excuse ends up eroding your self-esteem. Because you know when you're failing yourself. And even though you manage to deceive everyone, you can't escape from yourself. And here we enter an even sharper concept: structural dissonance. That contradiction not between what you think and do, but between the type of life you say you want and the decisions you make every day. You say you want peace, but you feed the conflict. You say you want genuine love, but you accept hollow relationships. You say you seek authenticity, but you keep imitating those you don't even respect. That's the most dangerous hypocrisy, because it's not about seeming virtuous. It's about believing your own excuses. And here comes another devastating point: identity as an emotional prison. You've told yourself so many times who you are that you can no longer afford to act outside of that character. You tell yourself, "I'm someone calm," and then you hide your anger. You tell yourself, "I'm strong," and then you never ask for help. You tell yourself, "I'm the funny one in the group," and then you swallow the pain to keep making others laugh. But what if you weren't any of that? What if you're just someone trying to survive? What would happen if you allowed yourself to break with the narrative you built so that they would accept you? The answer is brutally simple. You would feel free, but also terrified. Because freedom without a fixed identity gives vertigo. But that's where it starts to get interesting. When you stop seeing yourself as a label and start seeing yourself as a process. Because being human is not being a personal brand, it's being an ongoing experiment, an unfinished work. And that's where you can start to dismantle hypocrisy, not from rejection, but from exploration. Not asking, what? Not asking, what image must I maintain? But who am I being at this moment and why? And now, let's bring in a concept that you may have never connected with hypocrisy: the fear of chaos. Because being authentic is chaotic. It's unpredictable. It's showing contradictory emotions, uncomfortable thoughts, changing desires. And that's scary. That's why we prefer the order of the lie, the polished, coherent, safe narrative. But that order is artificial. It's a glass cage that in the long run becomes suffocation. Because the human being is not linear. You're not one thing. You have light and you have shadow. You have high ideals and dark thoughts. And as long as you keep trying to suppress what doesn't fit in your ideal self, you'll be trapped in permanent hypocrisy. Here comes another key point: morality as a tool of repression. Have you ever wondered how many of your contradictions come from trying to comply with a moral system that you didn't even choose yourself? Because much of what you consider correct or incorrect doesn't come from personal reflection. It comes from cultural, religious, family conditioning. And as long as you don't question that, you'll keep feeling guilty for natural desires. You'll keep believing that being authentic is being bad. And that's a psychological trap designed to control you. Now let's take it even further. Hypocrisy as a symptom of the fear of being forgotten. Because many times you don't pretend out of convenience, you pretend out of desperation. From that brutal anxiety born of existential emptiness, what if I'm not special? Then you build an approved version of yourself, one that others applaud, that others look at. But that's not real connection. It's emotional dependence. It's telling the world, please tell me who I am because I don't know. And that makes you vulnerable to everything. To external validation, to criticism, to manipulation. And it's at this point where hypocrisy stops being just a contradiction and becomes a strategy for emotional survival. A shield against the deepest human fear, the fear of not being enough. But that shield, which initially protects you, later imprisons you. And here comes the final paradox. To stop being a hypocrite, first you have to accept that you are one. And that's not a punishment, it's an act of radical honesty. It's a starting point. It's stopping idealizing yourself, stopping justifying yourself, stopping hiding behind what you should be. Because the more you allow yourself to be imperfect, the more coherent you become. And that's the coherence that matters, not the one of seeming perfect, but the one of being aligned with yourself, even when you're broken. So now, with all this on the table, ask yourself the question again. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when there's no audience, no applause, no judgment? Because that version, that's the only one that can free you. Everything else is noise. Noise that you disguise as virtue, but that doesn't let you sleep peacefully. And maybe, just maybe, the time has come to silence the noise and listen to yourself truly. If you've made it this far, if you've followed every word, every uncomfortable truth, every inward turn, then you're ready to look at the next level. Let's talk about something that we all suffer from, but few understand. Inherited hypocrisy. Yes, that which didn't originate from you, but was imposed on you even before you could think for yourself. Because you don't just pretend by choice, you pretend by upbringing. From a young age, we are trained to be contradictory. Don't you see? They taught you to tell the truth, but also to keep quiet out of respect. To be yourself, but only if it doesn't bother others. To express your emotions, but not too much, because that's being weak. And what do you do with that chaos? You swallow it. You internalize it. And you build an identity based on pleasing, not on being. The worst part is that this cultural hypocrisy is not experienced as a betrayal, but as a virtue. They call that education. To fake a smile when you don't want to be there, they call knowing how to be. To betray yourself to maintain harmony, they call it maturity. But maturity is not stopping feeling. It's learning to manage without lying to yourself. And what you experienced was not growth, it was domestication. And here comes something even more twisted. The hypocrisy of language. Because even the language is built to manipulate the truth. How many times did you say, "I'm busy," when you wanted to say, "I don't want to"? How many times did you say, "I understand," when you understood absolutely nothing? Language has become an emotional trench where you hide what you really feel. And you've done it so many times that you no longer notice it. And there enters another brutal concept: self-induced emotional amnesia. You get so used to pretending that your brain starts to erase what you really feel, to not suffer, to not enter into conflict. And over time, you lose your compass. You no longer know if you're sad or just tired. You don't know if you love or just fear being alone. You don't know if you hate your life or are just anesthetized. And that confusion is the direct result of years of micro-hypocrisies accepted as normality. And do you know what happens when you've been yourself for so long? that you become a stranger to yourself. You look in the mirror and recognize the face, but not the gaze. You feel that something is missing, but you don't know what. You go to therapy, read books, seek answers, and everything stays the same. Why? Because it's not a problem of information, it's a problem of sincere introspection. And for that, you have to have the courage to stop acting, the bravery to renounce the character. And we're not just talking about being honest with others. That's easy. The hard part is being honest with yourself, telling yourself the truth when you know it will hurt. Accepting that what you do every day looks nothing like what you say you are. Admitting that you are living on autopilot to avoid facing the emptiness of not having a fucking clue who you really are. And that emptiness, that vertigo, is what prevents many from taking the step. They prefer to continue playing a safe role than to venture to discover their essence without a script. But here's the key. You can only start to live when you stop interpreting. And here comes an argument that no one mentions. Hypocrisy is what keeps you sane in a sick system. Because if you were completely honest in a world that rewards the false, you would be rejected, excluded, punished. So, in a way, hypocrisy was your shield. But that shield, which was initially useful, today suffocates you. And the madness is not breaking with the system. The madness is continuing to pretend that you're okay while you break inside. And now that we're talking about systems, let's go deeper. The structural hypocrisy of success. They tell you that to be successful, you have to be authentic, but also diplomatic, brave but cautious, creative but obedient. Do you realize the level of contradiction? The same system that demands results penalizes you if you don't follow the rules. So, what do? You divide yourself. You break into pieces. One for work, another for family, another for networks. And you reach a point where you no longer know which one is the real you. And maybe, deep down, there's no longer a real you. Just functional fragments. Fragments that smile, that comply, that produce, but that don't feel. And the question is, how long are you going to sustain that performance? Because no one can pretend their whole life without breaking. No one can live divided without paying the price in the form of anxiety, emptiness, chronic dissatisfaction. And if you're feeling that now, if you're having trouble sleeping, if nothing fills you, if everything seems gray, it's not because you're broken, it's because you're disconnected. From you, from your truth, from what you really are when no one is watching. And now, as if that weren't enough, comes another enemy, spiritual hypocrisy, that you disguise as growth. I'm healing, you say, but you keep lying to yourself. You keep justifying your contradictions. You keep meditating on the outside while you sabotage yourself inside. Spirituality has become another social disguise, an excuse not to do the real work, to look at yourself in the mirror without filters, without motivational phrases, without mantras that cover the internal noise. Because real transformation doesn't happen when you say, "I am light," but when you have the courage to look at your darkness and not run away. So, what are you going to do with all this? You can ignore it, turn off the video, continue with your life, return to the character, pretend nothing is happening. Or you can face it. You can use this discomfort as a map, as the most honest signal that you are one step away from starting to live for real. Because if something moved you, if something in all this deeply unsettled you, then you don't need more proof. It's time to stop pretending. Hypocrisy is not combated with guilt. It is combated with awareness, and awareness starts now, here, in this moment, with you, only with you, without an audience, without a filter, without a script, just you, and your truth. Do you have the courage to hold it? Because if you do, then For the first time, you will start to be you, without adornments, without excuses, without needing to appear. Simply be.